Welcome back to the videos. This is setup tips and tricks video number 3. This video I'm going to be talking about a few setup tips and little tricks you can use to help you set up your banjo with a Presto tailpiece. I don't have to tell you guys how popular Presto is, and to me it's an important aspect and part of the sound of a master tone banjo. Not that I'm pushing a Presto above any other tailpiece. They all have their advantages. And you have to match a tailpiece to your individual setup and what you like a banjo to sound like. But, the classic Scruggs sound did include generally a Presto tailpiece. So it's pretty important that if you use a Presto to get it set up properly. So I'm going to talk about some of the do's and don'ts of setting up your banjo with a Presto, and a few little tricks that I use here in the shop. I work on over 100 banjos a year at least on average, and the majority of those banjos have Prestos. So I see a lot of Prestos come in here on banjos, and unfortunately I see a lot of them set up incorrectly. So let's talk about some of the don'ts with a Presto. And of course I'll always throw out the caveat here. This is my opinion and viewpoint. It's not gospel, so don't think anything I'm saying is gospel, but just from doing this practically my entire life, I see a lot of bent, broken, and mangled tailpieces, and the majority of them are from user error. That would be you. So they're not set up correctly. So let's talk about some of the don'ts with the Presto. One of the things you don't generally want to do with a Presto is to take the screw, which you see is removed from this tailpiece. You don't want to crank that screw all the way in and then crank the tailpiece all the way to the bottom. Bottom being that it's pulled down to the top of the tension hoop and sometimes beyond. Most of the broken Prestos that I've seen are from people running that screw in the hole and then adjusting the hanger bolt to the point that the Presto is just pushed to the breaking point, and then they'll use tall bridges. Tall bridges have become in vogue in the last couple of decades. I've had banjos with Prestos that came in the shop that had bridges an inch or above, an inch tall bridge with a Presto, with the screw run in, with the hanger bolt pulled down to the max, and of course they break or they bend. And this is the weakest part of a Presto. This is the one area of the Presto that doesn't like to be overly stressed, because that is the thinnest and lightest area of the tailpiece. But again, now Prestos get the reputation for being easy to break and flimsy. I have not found them to be easy to break or flimsy. I actually have a box of tailpieces in the shop of all brands, every brand of tailpiece you can name, every style of tailpiece. They all break. The two main reasons that a tailpiece would break would be metal fatigue, it's just done all it can do, or user error. And the majority of them unfortunately tend to be user error. So you can overly stress any tailpiece, Presto is no exception, and you can shorten the lifespan of a tailpiece greatly by some of the things you do to overly stress it. So the first thing is to remove the screw, because Prestos are not generally adjustable. They're not designed to adjust left or right, or the front edge of the tailpiece pointed down. They're floating tailpieces. But you would think being a floating tailpiece without an anchor screw here means that the tailpiece is just inconsistent in its stability, and it wobbles around. Again, they only wobble around if they're set up incorrectly. So let's talk about do's. Now we have the don'ts already. The don't is don't overly stress the tailpiece especially if you use an exceedingly tall bridge, and don't run this screw in, and don't run the tension on the hanger bolt all the way down. They're floating tailpieces. Now you've got a lot of leeway in how far you want them to float. I've seen some players that float their tailpiece almost to the extreme end of what's possible with a hanger bolt. I mean, there's only like 1 or 2 threads remaining before the tailpiece flies off the banjo. And then I've seen, again, people crank them all the way down to the tension hoop and beyond, which is, way too much. So there's a happy medium in there that you'll find for your banjo. And again, a lot of that has to do with the size bridge you use. The taller the bridge, the more careful you have to be with those tensions. What are some of the tips, some of the do's? Well, so some of the do's, making sure, first of all, that when you, and I'm going to try to stay in a camera shot because, again, I can't see my screen. I'm on my iPad. Make sure that when you make adjustments here, do make sure that all the slack is out of the system. What do you mean by slack, you might ask? Well, I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to loosen this tailpiece hanger bolt nut. Alright, now you're going to see something kind of strange happen. If you watch the Presto, the name stamped in the back of this, as I move this screw, you might see a little movement with the tailpiece, and then all of a sudden this happens. Watch. This is pretty common on Prestos that have been on banjos for a while. I think what happens is the metal back plate, if you want to call it, this flat metal surface becomes slightly deformed under pressure of the strings, and it actually takes some of the curvature of the tension hoop. And even though I have the hanger, I wouldn't want to do it without taking this all the way off, because I'm afraid if it does decide to slip, it'll fly off the banjo. But I could probably, heck, let's do it. Look, I have removed the nut completely from the hanger bolt, and this thing is still in place. That's actually a good sign in one way, because it shows me that this backing plate is fully engaged with the tension hoop, which is part of its stability. But let's get this back on here just in case it flies off and knocks a hole in my shop wall here. But, so, even though you have loosened the hanger bolt, even if you're making a small adjustment, let's say you just turn this with a nut wrench just 2 or 3 times and it looks like the tailpiece is moved, you should check this nut for slack. And if this happens, that means there's some excess tension that's not being released in this system here, in this rod. So what I'm going to do is take my thumb, and hopefully this will catch it in the video. I'm going to push up. I just felt a very small amount of movement. I've actually taken the slack out of the Presto. And now if I check this nut, it's very tight. I can't turn it with my finger now. So let's loosen it a little more, and hopefully we can repeat this in the video. So I'm going to, and I'm trying to stay in the camera shot, I'm going to remove a little tension. There again, look. I'm going to leave a little more this time, maybe about 2 turns of looseness there. Watch this. You may have seen it in the video. Now it's tight again. So sometimes when you try to float the tailpiece up, let the Presto come up, check the tension. Just take underneath, and if your cover's removed, just, kind of lay your thumb all the way across your finger and pull up, and you'll actually feel the tension remove. Now, stability-wise, if you decide to float up or you decide to crank it down a little more, wherever you find that sweet spot in your system, you may notice that after you make an adjustment up or down, that you can actually take the tailpiece and do this. Look. And I'm not applying this, I'm really not pushing very hard here. What's happened is, because of the floating nature of the Presto, sometimes particularly when you loosen this hanger bolt and try to float the tailpiece up, you've changed the tension on the banjo. So if I check my tuning now, I'm down to a C sharp. So part of the reason this is not as stable now is, I've raised the tailpiece, so I've reduced string tension, so now I've got to check to make sure I'm back to standard pitch. Alright, now, this is going to seem like an awkward tip, but it actually works. I'm going to take my hand and actually just use the inside of my wrist there, the fleshy part of my hand, and I'm just kind of gently bumping this. What am I doing that for? Because sometimes there's some slack in a Presto where you've moved up and it's actually moved away from the tension hoop slightly because of the string tension being lowered. So once I tune it back up to standard, then I'll actually do this, and that helps to reseat it against the tension hoop. Now, even if I were to tighten this hanger bolt and I wanted to pull, and you can see how much this is floating now, if I get a right camera angle. See, it's pretty high up there. So let's say I wanted to reduce that that opening between the head and the tension hoop. I want to bring the tailpiece down. Okay. I'll start to turn it, and you may notice that you're turning and turning and turning, but the tailpiece doesn't seem to be coming down. What happens sometimes is the actual hanger bolt itself, there'll be so much tension in the system that it will actually spin in the hole in this. You see the Presto has a little lip here with a hole in it. The entire hanger bolt will be turning. Instead of the tailpiece coming down, all you're doing is spinning that rod around. Well, there's two little things you can do. You can put a lock washer under here, or you can take a rough metal file and kind of roughen the underside of the hanger bolt nut. That's what I've done here in this one. I've actually removed this rod enough, the threaded rod up enough where I can take a rough file. You could actually also roughen up this surface here too, because this plating can be kind of slick. Just remove the bolt altogether and take a little short metal file, a rough one, and kind of roughen this surface. That'll give you some tension, some friction tension there to help keep that from spinning. So once you've determined that the actual nut itself and the rod is not spinning, as you start to bring the tailpiece down, you would think, well, I'm introducing more tension into the system, so that should make this tailpiece more stable, right? Well, not necessarily, because you can also be pulling this away from the tension hoop. Again, after I make an adjustment, I'll just tap the tailpiece like that. And here's my little litmus test. If this thing is set correctly, even though it's still floating, you can see in the video, I'm still floating above the tension hoop a good amount. This thing is extremely stable. I cannot move it. Part of this will happen over time. If you set your tailpiece up correctly and you kind of bump it, make sure there's no excess slack in here, I think the backing plate on your Presto, this metal part that sits against the tension hoop, will actually start to conform a little bit to the curvature of your tension hoop. So over time you'll get a better fit. But you should make sure to keep the thing stable to check it with your hand. You shouldn't be able to move that thing hardly at all. So either way I go, even if I really let this tailpiece out, I'm really going to push this thing up. Test the limits of this. And I see, look at my hanger bolt. You see my hanger bolt turning? That's what I was talking about. There's so much relieved tension in the system now that the whole thing is turning. So I'm going to pull with my hand a little bit. Now I'm going to push up. Look at that jump. See how much that tailpiece jumped? Now this is way more than I would ever want, but just for illustration purposes. So even though I'm this high up, I can still adjust this hanger bolt a little bit, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to check it. It is extremely stable. So one of those myths about a Presto is, oh, you can't get them stable. They just move around too much. I would challenge anybody to come in here now and try to move this Presto. I can barely move it. I'm taking a lot of pressure to actually try to move this thing. It's extremely stable. So either direction you go, either back down or up, whichever way you decide to go, make sure that your hanger bolt itself is not spinning. And then when you find that sweet spot, check it, and always check your tuning during all of these adjustments. See, now I'm sharp. So after I make any adjustment, I'll make sure I'm back to standard pitch, and then I'll go through my routine of checking everything, checking the hanger bolt, and making sure it's centered. And you'll find that if you set this Presto up and use some of these tips and tricks that I've shown you, it will be extremely strong, extremely stable. And you know, I have a lot of pre-war Prestos here in the shop I've used on my pre-war banjos. They're over 80 years old. They still work perfectly. So don't automatically assume that if you use a Presto it's going to break after a year or two, or that it's going to be very unstable. They're very stable and very secure if they're installed properly. So hopefully these little pointers will help you with your Presto, and I hope you enjoyed the video. We'll catch you next time.